Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? Let me introduce you to our panel for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have Mr. Tim Schultz, President of the First Amendment Partnership, an organization dedicated to protecting religious freedom for Americans of all faith. We have Mr. Vilo Weiss, who's the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Indiana Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Lawrence Brown, the Associate Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Gentlemen, good having you here with us. Looking forward to our conversations for today. You know, one of the things that we've seen now at the end of this midterm elections, there's always been this conversation about the impact of evangelicals. There have been leadership groups who have been working on evangelical activism, and for decades there have been roles where we've even seen groups like Faith and Freedom Coalition that have been pledging to put $40 million here, $25 million here. And so for the last probably 10 years, it seems that we have seen a turning point where we've seen a group that's calling themselves evangelicals that want to be an impactful part of the election process, but they want to be involved in a way where they don't end up creating any IRS prohibitions by creating some issues for their tax-exempt nonprofit groups. You know, I got to ask you, Tim Schultz, we're starting to see all of this activities where quote-unquote evangelicals were supposed to be causing some big changes in this last election, might have seen a huge red wave coming in, but it didn't turn out to be that way at all. So the question I'm having is, what was the real impact of evangelicals in this last midterm?
Well, in the last midterm, I think that evangelicals probably did not prove to be the decisive vote for the Republican Party, right? Evangelicals, at least white evangelicals, generally vote Republican and are maybe the most important core coalition in the Republican Party right now. And so the fact that Republicans kind of had an underwhelming night in the midterms means that evangelicals perhaps didn't deliver what consultants wanted them to deliver. But that varies by election, right? I think that evangelicals have been a core part of the Republican coalition going back at least to Ronald Reagan's campaign for presidency in 1980. And I think that Republicans don't always win national elections. So I think that they're a very important part of the Republican kind of core voter bloc, but not always decisive.
You know, Todd, I got to ask you this question, though. We seem to hear a lot about the religious right, but sometimes we don't hear a lot about the religious left. We're starting to see that maybe the religious left is actually having more of an impact. I mean, we see that we have a Baptist preacher who's actually a senator right now. And the way these things seem to be moving, maybe it's not simply about quote unquote evangelicals, but maybe really it's a pretty even toss up between both of these groups. Am I missing something here or is there some validity to that?
Well, I think, certainly, as Tim said, evangelicals are not able to, or any one group, quite frankly, able to consistently deliver wins. And we do see sort of people more progressive, accounting religion and, senator from Georgia with a religious background and others. But I think just mathematically, you'd be hard pressed to show that group even comes close to challenging evangelicals when it comes to an importance in elections. I think the lefts or Democrats, base comes from other areas than progressive, left-leaning religious individuals. Because quite frankly, most individuals who are left-leaning are more in the none category that Tim mentioned on a prior show than they are sort of active, in religious sphere.
But Vilo, I have to ask you this question then. If it turns out that evangelicals are involved so much politically, why is it not creating any issues with the IRS as it relates to their quote unquote nonprofit status? I thought we wanted to make sure that if you were going to be a religious group, you had to not be involved in partisan activities, or is that something that's actually more conversation and less actual practice?
Probably the latter. I'm seeing more and more pastors say that they want to talk about it. They say it's infringement on their free speech rights not to talk about it, and it seems like the IRS hasn't gone after them I'm a little surprised sometimes, particularly if they start raising a lot of money and endorsing candidates. But they're really, a lot of the pastors, Sunday pastors, are raising the free speech argument.
And I guess, Lawrence, it's probably safe to say this is probably on both sides of the street. I mean, you live in a city, New York City, where you see pastors that are bringing in large political people on a regular basis. I'm not sure if they're telling their congregation who to vote for, but if I bring you in, chances are I probably like you. So what exactly are we seeing? Is it really one of those, quiet, underlying secrets that everybody's really doing this?
Well, anyone would be naive to think that there's not a lot of activity between church groups and what's happening with government. And to a certain extent, I think it's appropriate because somebody has to be the moral voice. And sometimes the church is well situated to help move things a certain direction. But here's the thing. It has been pointed out before that sometimes the religious right is not religious, and it's sometimes not right either. And I feel as though some of what you saw in this last election is because a correction had to happen. What am I talking about? A few years ago, you saw a group of people who, frankly, I would have had more respect for them if they said, listen, we understand what the issues are with this candidate. We frown on how he is living and what he is doing. But we appreciate the fact that he's getting some things done for us that we wanted done. So we're going to run with him. That's not what you heard. What you heard was people straining, bending over backwards, trying to somehow articulate why what we saw wasn't really what we were seeing, and somehow trying to make it sound like this person has been baptized and covered with holy water, and now as a result, he's somebody we can all embrace, when quite frankly, that was never, ever the case. And I think it's embarrassing for a religious group to be caught trying to pacify, trying to baptize, trying to somehow sprinkle holy water on what we all know is nonsense. And you just need to call nonsense for what it is and stop trying to act like it's not what we all know it is. And so what you saw in the last little bit here, hopefully, is the understanding that we need to sometimes proceed with caution and not go running down the road trying to turn something into something other than what it clearly is.
But Tim Schultz, I got to ask you this. Why do you have to be, quote unquote, an evangelical group to take on this position? What is the purpose of that particular grouping? As Todd mentioned, you could be parts of other groupings that actually end up supporting candidates, but it seemed as though that's a distinct position and moniker they wanted to have. What is the benefit of that?
That's a really complex question. Part of it is that a lot of people increasingly are identifying as evangelical, not because they hold theologically evangelical beliefs, but because the term has become synonymous with a certain political identity. And so this is what the research is finding over the last few years, that the term has gotten really slippery because it's become so enmeshed with political identity rather than a religious identity. And that's part of the reason why the whole discussion is such a tricky one, because it's kind of like, are we talking about people who are religiously evangelical or people who are using that as a kind of summary term for a certain kind of conservative politics?
And I guess that's the real question, Todd. Are we necessarily talking about a group that's utilizing the moniker evangelical because it's clearly a focus on, quote unquote, being religious? Or is it just simply a group of individuals that have some religious connections that may be looking to basically move forward in a political way?
Well, first of all, the evangelical term, I think, is one that has been embraced as much by the secular press as a description as it been by that group itself. And oftentimes, I think as Tim said, it gets sort of as a very easy, like anyone who's religious and Christian who supports, sort of a political right gets labeled as evangelical. And I would say most political reporters writing on that couldn't define an evangelical if their life depended on it. But, I think one of the things that has really contributed to it is there is this sense that one's sort of lifestyle and viewpoint is under attack, and that if one doesn't sort of strike out in the ballot box, then that, that they're just at risk of being erased or made illegal. Right? When you see sort of laws that, require, for instance, a Christian baker to bake cakes for same-sex marriages that he doesn't support, some people see that as being, discrimination. Others say, wait a minute, you mean I could be forced to do something against my conscience or have to give up my job or give up my business? And there's been, I think, a lot of, sort of feeling of sort of under attack and under pressure. And that has, I think, really contributed to sort of a solidarity on the political side. I would also like to point out, by the way, that hypocrisy runs both ways. In the late 1990s, there was a Democratic president who unquestionably engaged in inappropriate sexual activity. And if you think that, a party that, purports to support women and women's rights made every excuse under the sun for that behavior. And so, I just think that, people are much more interested, sort of in who's on their side too many times rather than any kind of principled belief and willing to call out, inappropriate behavior.
Well, it sounds like that's pretty much where we are as a society now, that we look at difference of opinions and we decide that we're going to vote basically on specific issues, but we're not necessarily looking at the whole person or the whole party or the whole set of circumstances. I mean, is that where we are as a people right now?
Well, here's the problem. The problem is folks, in an effort to stay as a part of the herd, are willing to many times do things that are not in their best interest. Case in point, there were many people talking about wanting to get rid of Obamacare. And the fact was that in many small rural communities, the only employers are the clinics that were, hey, guess what, funded by Obamacare. So in getting rid of that source, you were also going to get rid of your lone source of employment. And yet, because that's where everyone was pushing and wanted to go, people were chanting for it, even though it wasn't in their best interest. And so I think we've found ourselves in a very odd and funny place right now. And I don't know that it gets any better moving forward.
Well, I would think the way we're looking at this, the role of evangelicals is one that's probably going to get even stronger. I don't see it as being something that's going to be getting diminished in any way. But you do have to be concerned, Vilo, when it turns out that an evangelical group is putting more money in a governor's race than the Republican Governors Association. I mean, when it gets to that point, shouldn't we start saying, well, wait a second, maybe we need to take and pump the brakes a little bit on this?
No, I couldn't agree more, because when you're putting money in, you often are expecting to get some type of payback. And I think we've forgotten what Jesus said. He said, if my kingdom was of this world, my servants would fight. And we need to be involved in helping those that are in need and a lot of things. But I think evangelicalism has prostituted itself to some degree politically.
Well, I think, I'd have to let that be the last word on that, Vilo. And I think the point that you've raised about how we should be looking at what we're doing as being the hands and feet of Christ and trying to deliver for the good for individuals, regardless of whether you're on the left or you're on the right. But hopefully when it's all said and done, we're doing just simply what's in the best interest of everyone. We'd like to talk with you guys about an interesting case. It's called Franciscan Alliance versus Becerra. It's a case in which it really started dealing with a federal mandate that was issued in 2016 as part of Obamacare that was requiring doctors and hospitals across the country to perform transgender or gender transition procedures on any patient, even including a child, if that procedure were to violate. What we are looking to figure out is where this particular court case can go as a result of the fact that now there are many who are in hospitals and doctors who are pushing back and saying that we don't want to get involved in these type of activities at all. Todd, could you give us a little bit of color on this case, how it got to where it is and where we might see it going?
Sure. So as part of the Affordable Care Act, there were put in provisions there about non-discrimination. And one of those provisions was non-discrimination on the basis of sex. And the administration, the Obama administration, interpreted that as including those seeking what they would term gender-affirming surgeries or transitioning surgeries, and essentially saying that a doctor or a healthcare provider has to provide that, and if they do, or won't provide those services, then they're discriminating. Now, I want to be very clear here. No one was challenging that if a person who is transgendered comes in for, say, cardiac care or other kind of transitioning surgeries, that you couldn't discriminate against them. That part of the bill wasn't being challenged, but this sort of mandate that you had to participate in these surgeries that many would think are both morally opposed to and also think medically are just not in their best interest were challenged. So sort of what happened logistically was that was in the middle of being challenged during the Obama administration, 2016. We changed administrations as far as parties, and then it kind of was on hold during the Trump era. But then when Biden came in, then all of those regulations were sort of resurrected, and there's been further attempts at implementing those. The decision that was made in Obergefell in another case called Bostock didn't help on that front. And so these various healthcare providers are challenging this, saying, listen, this is not what the Affordable Care Act required, and to the extent these regulations do require it, it violates my religious belief.
So Tim Schultz, did Obamacare get this wrong? Was that mandate something that was probably not necessary?
Well, I see, again, this is back to what we have discussed before, is that this case really arose from interpretations by administrative agencies. This wasn't something directly voted on by the Congress at Obamacare. If it had, it would have been much more controversial. This is an agency interpretation, and I think that's part of the problem. Congress is sort of delegating these very, very tricky questions to administrative agencies rather than sort of taking the heat and acting like Congress should.
Well, then it begs the question then, who should be making these calls? I mean, now we're going to find ourselves in a court system where we have judges that may not even be experts in this area, and now they've got to make the call. So, Lawrence, is this just creating more and more confusion as we move down this process?
Listen, it is very problematic if you're going to look a doctor in the face and say to him, you are required to do this particular procedure. And we don't even have to address the issue of what his own personal beliefs about it morally or whatever else may be. It is tantamount to parts of the country where women who wanted to give birth were having trouble finding doctors to do it because those doctors made a decision based on the liability issues that they no longer wanted to practice in that area. So how do we then turn around in another area of medicine and tell a doctor, this is something you have to do? That is a road I would never, ever want to walk down. Just like I would not want somebody telling me as a minister of the gospel that I am required to perform a same-sex marriage. There are some heterosexual couples that I will not marry because I just can't sign off on it. So much less somebody trying to tell me that I am compelled to do a particular thing. So let us hope that professionals who are trained to do these particular things are not put in a situation where these optional procedures are now forced upon them under threat of penalty or even losing their license.
Well, Vilo, it looks like the Fifth Circuit was pretty clear on this. This was actually a unanimous decision on their part in ruling for the doctors and basically putting them in a position where they would not be required to do anything that they were uncomfortable with. But what happens if you're a doctor who works for a hospital that does engage in this activity and they call you in? Is this one of those things where doctors can basically walk and decide to go someplace else? Or do we have to ensure that hospitals are not really trying to put any pressure on their employees to engage in these type of activities?
Well, that was what was happening probably in some degree before. And I'm grateful that the Fifth Circuit has ruled that doctors can practice law without being forced to do that. This was an intrusion into the practice of medicine, and that was very, very concerning to me. It ran roughshod over their medical opinion, and I'm glad that they gave them an option to do that. Now, whether the hospital is going to allow them to walk or not, that remains to be seen. Who knows?
Well, what we're seeing now, it looks like we're finding ourselves in a society where we're not sure exactly who's forcing who to do what. But I think it's so important that doctors do have the ability to, quote unquote, engage in certain activities that they feel comfortable with. But the question then becomes, do we need to have some type of sincerity test regarding what a doctor may want to engage in? They may be comfortable maybe in engaging in the termination of a birth, but maybe not comfortable in terms of a transgender surgery. Does it matter? Or is it simply something we should always leave in the hands of an individual? Tim Schultz, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think you want to, we've talked about, you don't necessarily want the person who takes your photographs on your wedding day to be somebody who doesn't want to be there. You definitely don't want a person who does a delicate surgery on you to be somebody who doesn't want to be there, right? So I think that that's going to work itself out a little bit because of that fact. Much as a lot of these wedding vendor cases make a lot of headlines, but there's like 10 of them total. And I think in the end, this is going to make a lot of headlines, but I don't think it's going to end up ensnaring that many people.
Well, I think one thing.
But Tim, don't
go ahead.
Tim, don't you think? Yeah, don't you think part of this though is attempting to not just, you're right, compel people to do this who don't want to, but also to sort of change the culture and to try to institute this as like, oh, not performing, a transitioning surgery is just like not providing service to people based upon other protected classes. I think it is as much to do with, getting people to perform the services, or it's as much to do with trying to sort of establish a moral standard, right? Not just a legal one, as it is to get people to actually perform these services. And over time, things get changed. And so I think that's kind of really where the push is here. It's not just providing the services, but also, like I said, trying to establish like what is socially acceptable, not just legally acceptable.
And I think that's the crux of the matter right there, Todd. Trying to bring in a moral argument as it relates to these type of activities, trying to find if there's a way to cause a society to believe that these are just regular, run of the day, these are things that doctors should be doing. And it seems as though this is still going to be something that's going to be decided, I would say even region by region. There will be some places in the country more comfortable with this and others that won't be. But at the end of the day, it sounds like the courts are really trying to figure out how to put something in place. But I got to ask you guys, how do you find that balance between the moral arguments of making sure you're taking care of people who are in need that may not be able to afford to, and the political or legal argument to ensure that you're not shunning somebody just from a discriminatory standpoint?
Very carefully.
And I would also say very slowly. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Vilo.
You should be able to make referrals, and I would hope that people would be accepting of that.
Well, and I think that's a good point, because what we're also talking about here is a religious hospital that has, quote unquote, its own principles that it relies on. If it maybe were a different type of hospital, maybe you could have different conversations. But, Todd, there are a lot of religious hospitals that engage in activities that sometimes people wonder about. But I think most of them have a specific line in the sand in which they will operate. I mean, am I missing something with that?
No, I think so. I mean, religious hospitals do spend a lot of time and effort thinking about where their moral stands are, what they're comfortable with doing. They have entire committees to this and multidisciplinary approaches, with people being on there, both the medical, the theological, et cetera. I mean, listen, any large institution like that is going to be doing things, that you just like, well, listen, they all sue their former patients, right, to get paid. I mean, that's just a part of being a hospital, and you can say, well, listen, if you're really a charity, you should be suing people to, who can't pay you and imposing upon them tens of thousands of dollars of debt. And, but that's just in many ways part of being a healthcare institution, because the reality is their employees expect to be paid. And, for them to get paid. But, I think these hospitals do spend a lot of time thinking about it. And listen, reasonable people can come to different views on these issues. But we should let the hospitals and religious organizations that are behind them make the decision, not even the government as far as Congress, but literally government bureaucrats.
Well, I got to tell you one thing, and I'm an individual who sits on a hospital board. One of the best money makers in hospitals are elective surgeries. And these are the types of things that I could see a hospital coming back and saying, listen, We're trying to maintain an operation here. We're trying to generate revenue here. And as a result, these are things we may want to be doing from a business perspective. So if you're looking to do this from a business perspective, because it just makes economic sense, do you think that type of organization has the ability to potentially force or to coerce someone to say, this is something we want to do in the best interest of the financial interest of our organization?
I still think it's problematic because just like to take a Christian website developer and tell him he has to develop this new pornographic site. I mean, you're going to get yourself in quite the situation if you put that fine of a head on it, on the pen, where you're trying to tell people for financial reasons, this is what we all have to do, period, full stop, end of story. Yeah, that's a problem.
Tim Schultz, let me give you the last word on this.
Well, I think that you kind of touched on something that long-term might be an issue is people who work in for-profit hospitals who are doing surgeries, then expecting their employees to do it. And that's why we need to pass the Workplace Religious Freedom Act or overturn the TWA versus Artisan case or both, because people that work in for-profit businesses have conscience rights too.
Well, I have to let that be the last word, Tim, but I think we brought it to a good point, talking about the difference between for-profit and nonprofit organizations and realizing that some of the calls that are being made are not necessarily about religion, but sometimes simply about economics. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
One of the oldest conservation laws we have in the country, the Migratory Bird Act, contains exceptions for Native Americans and others that have religious need to use eagle feathers and others, and that's been part of our culture for well over 100 years.
Wow. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
The incoming Republican majority in the House, ruling with the smallest and narrowest of margins and not having a lot of practice at doing it, are going to discover that you need to be careful what you wish for because sometimes you just might get it.
Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
You know what FDR called the 4 justices that voted against his New Deal legislation?
No.
4 horsemen.
Absolutely. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
There's an idea that many religious people have that their students go off to college and lose their religion. It's actually a myth. People who are young, who have gone to college, are slightly more religious than people who don't. There's no evidence for the thesis that people go off. There might be individual examples, but in the aggregate, going to college doesn't make you less religious. It actually makes you slightly more religious.
Thanks, you guys, for that great insight and all of that great information for today. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith in politics. See you next time.